They went underground every single day, into darkness, into dust, into danger. Not for wealth, not for comfort, but to survive. Long before 1949, coal had already changed Enugu. Discovered in the early 20th century, coal quickly became one of the most valuable resources in colonial Nigeria. To the British, it was fuel. Fuel for ships, fuel for railways, fuel for an empire that depended on constant movement. But that fuel came at a cost, a human cost. Thousands of African workers were recruited into the mines, men from different regions, drawn by the promise of wages. But what they found was something else. Each morning before sunrise, the miners prepared for work. Simple clothing, worn-out sandals or bare feet. Some carried small lamps, others carried nothing but tools. They entered the mines in groups, walking into narrow tunnels carved deep into the earth. The deeper they went, the darker it became. The air grew heavier, thick with coal dust, hard to breathe, hard to see. There were no proper safety systems, no real protection. The tunnels were unstable, wooden supports barely holding the weight above. At any moment, they could collapse, and sometimes they did. Men were injured, some never came out. But the work did not stop. It couldn't, because above ground, life was just as hard. The wages were low, barely enough to feed a family. Food was expensive, living conditions were poor. Many miners lived in overcrowded settlements, small rooms, limited space, little comfort. Yet every day they returned to the mines because they had no choice. But pressure does not disappear. It builds, silently, until one day it reaches its limit. By 1949, that limit had been reached. The miners had endured enough. They began to talk, quietly at first, among themselves. After long days underground, conversations turned into frustration. Frustration turned into anger. They wanted change, better wages, safer conditions, respect, basic dignity. So they made a decision. They would stop working. When the strike began, the mines fell silent. No digging, no movement, no coal. For the first time in a long time, the system paused. But to the colonial authorities, this was dangerous, because the mines were not just workplaces, they were part of a larger machine. And if that machine stopped, the empire felt it. Officials quickly responded. Warnings were issued, orders were given, return to work or face consequences. But the miners refused. They stood together. They gathered in groups, discussing their demands, holding their ground. There was tension in the air, a sense that something bigger was coming. On November 18, 1949, that tension reached its peak. At the Iva Valley coal mine in Enugu, miners gathered, unarmed, peaceful. They were not there to fight. They were there to stand. Then the police arrived, armed. Their presence changed everything. The atmosphere shifted. Silence mixed with fear. The miners did not attack, they did not run. They stood their ground. Moments passed, heavy, uncertain. And then, gunshots. The police opened fire. Panic, chaos, shock. Unarmed men fell to the ground. Men who had spent years underground trying to survive were now dying above it. At least 21 miners were killed. Many more were injured. The ground was stained, and the silence that followed was louder than the gunshots. News of the shooting spread quickly, across Enugu, across Nigeria. People were outraged. This was no longer just about wages, it was about justice. How could workers, unarmed, be shot for demanding better conditions? The incident shook the nation. Protests grew. Voices became louder. The Enugu coal miners were no longer just workers. They became a symbol of resistance, a symbol of sacrifice. Their deaths exposed the harsh reality of colonial rule, and it forced people to confront a painful truth, that the system was built on inequality and maintained by force. The impact went far beyond the mines. It strengthened the growing movement for independence. It gave people a reason to question authority, to demand change, to resist. Because if miners could be killed for simply asking for dignity, then something was deeply wrong. The Enugu shooting became a turning point, not just in labor history, but in Nigeria's journey toward freedom. The miners had gone on strike for better conditions, but their sacrifice became something much greater. It became part of a larger struggle. A struggle for justice, for dignity, for independence. They did not carry weapons. They carried courage, and even in death, their voices were heard. Because after Enugu, silence was no longer possible. The demand for change could not be ignored, and the path toward independence became clearer. They went underground to survive. But their struggle rose above everything, and history remembered them. From the forests to the streets to the mines, resistance never died. It only changed its form. Follow and subscribe for more untold stories.